on CityCast Madison. It's 2024, baby. We are in a supernova of an election year. And in our recent spring election, Wisconsinites voted to approve 2 amendments to our Constitution on how elections are run in our state. One bans anyone other than the government from funding elections. The other says only election officials can run elections. Simple enough, right? Not quite, says Madison City Attorney Michael Haas. He worries there could be messy lawsuits ahead. Dylan Brogan asks Attorney Haas why and what they mean for November's presidential election. It's Monday, April 22nd. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about.
City Attorney Haas, thank you for being here on CityCast Madison.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So voters approved 2 new amendments to the state constitution in April. One of these amendments restricts election-related tasks to election officials only. So you and other local officials around the state have some concerns about that amendment. So what exactly is the problem here as you see it?
Well, thanks, Dylan. I've been telling anybody who's willing to listen that I think that question 2 has a potential of creating a real mess for local clerks and more voter confusion around Wisconsin. Anything that creates questions about how elections are being conducted creates just confusion for voters and, questions about the validity of the results. I think specifically the vagueness of the constitutional amendment, both in who is an election official and what is a task in the conduct of an election, makes it really difficult for clerks to figure out what they have to do and what they can do to comply with the amendment.
So what do you think the worst case scenario is for local clerks in terms of this new amendment? You say it's vague. Are they worried about lawsuits? Are they worried about breaking the law?
I think both. I will say at the outset, just to not be alarmist about it, is that we are hoping that the Wisconsin Elections Commission is going to provide some guidance to clerks. I expect in the next month or month and a half, hopefully that they will have a meeting to try to provide some guidance and see if they can provide some guidance. It's interesting because there's not a lot of legal authority for them to go on to interpret this constitutional amendment. But I think to answer your question, clerks are not only concerned about lawsuits, but in the first instance, they want to comply with the law. They want to conduct elections consistently across the state and fairly and legally, and not have people question what their actions are. Unfortunately, the norm has been, especially since 2020, for clerks to be nitpicked and everything they do to be challenged or questioned because some people don't like the results of the election. And so they're looking for people to blame.
Well, maybe before we get too far, though. So this amendment restricts election-related tasks to election officials only. So a lot goes into administering an election. So what's tripping you up here? What do you think is confusing or vague about it?
Well, I'll tell you, the first time I read it, I thought, well, this is not a big deal. This is what we do anyway. And I think maybe that was a little bit naive as I started thinking about it more and talking to more people. There are a lot of people who are currently not election officials that assist clerks in pulling off the election. And currently, the only election officials that are authorized in the statutes are people like the clerk and the clerk staff, poll workers, canvass board members, special voting deputies who conduct elections in adult care facilities, and canvass board members.
So those are the election officials we have now.
Correct. And so the amendment says only election officials can complete tasks in the conduct of an election. So what are tasks in the conduct of an election? Is it only things that happen at the polling place on election day, or is it everything that goes into being able to conduct an election? So I think of 2 categories of people that complete tasks in the conduct of an election. We have all kinds of municipal staff that assist the clerk's office. It could be public works staff setting up a polling place. It could be the IT department providing cybersecurity. It could be the police department helping to secure the transport of ballots back from the polling places. It could be the people that municipal staff who are helping to get the absentee ballots in the envelopes and mailed out to voters. Those are all people completing tasks in the conduct of an election. Or at least people could argue that, who want, again, to challenge what clerks are doing. The second category of people I think of is all the vendors that we have. And this could be the printer who's printing ballots, a mailing house helping to put the absentee ballot mailing together. We contract with trucking companies to get the voting equipment safely and securely to the polling places. Those things, in my mind, can all be argued to be tasks in the context of an election. We can't have an election unless we have ballots printed by an outside printer. So this amendment has really put clerks, I think, in a bind to try to figure out, are the current election officials the only ones who can do all of those tasks? Or do we have to appoint all of those municipal staff and all of those vendors as election officials?
You mentioned it earlier, the Wisconsin Election Commission might be the agency to provide guidance here. You have some experience with that commission. The commission has been deadlocked along partisan lines before. Do you think ultimately the clarity that clerks need will come from the Wisconsin Election Commission?
That's an excellent point, but there's also a separate difficulty or challenge for the Elections Commission. As you know, Dylan, there are 3 Democratic appointees, 3 Republican appointees. Sometimes they deadlock. That's the system that the legislature created intentionally. Sometimes they are able to get a consensus when it comes to more administrative issues and supporting the clerks. And I have to say the 2 former clerks on the Election Commission, I think, play a key role in educating the commission about what the clerks need to conduct elections. But for anybody who's been paying attention to the Elections Commission work ever since it started, I think will understand that when they issue guidance, that guidance does not have the effect of law unless it is promulgated as an administrative rule. And there have been lawsuits brought and there have been court decisions declaring that the guidance of the Elections Commission was incorrect under the law and had to be withdrawn. But as I said, guidance is only guidance. And ultimately, it's the municipalities or the municipal clerk that is going to be sued if there's a challenge. And so the legislature, again, has set up a system where their guidance can only be binding if it's in the form of an administrative rule. And the legislature has also made it incredibly difficult to promulgate administrative rules. The legislature has oversight and essentially veto power over those administrative rules. So
this seems like a pretty low bar to clear, though, that you passed this constitutional amendment in the legislature and the voters approved it. Who decides what the hell it means, though?
Great question. And I think that kind of goes to why we see these constitutional amendments passed. It was pretty clear that they were passed by the legislature because they could not enact this in legislation that would be signed by the governor. So the supporters of this specifically said, we are passing this, first of all, as policy, which has not typically become part of the state constitution, but they're passing it because they couldn't get their ideas past the governor. But I also hear the main sponsor, Senator Wimberger, saying this language has to be vague. That's what constitutions are all about. We can't anticipate everything. And the Constitution has broad language. For elections, it only has language related to the qualifications of voters and the qualifications of candidates. It has nothing else related to elections. So now, in my view, if the legislature is going to substitute constitutional amendments for the regular process of legislating, which is much more specific, they have a responsibility to make sure that that constitutional amendment is as clear as statutory language normally is.
Okay. So when do clerks have to follow guidance from the Wisconsin Election Commission?
The way we look at it, I think as clerks and as attorneys for municipalities who are subject to being sued, is guidance from the Elections Commission, we hope, will give us some protection against litigation. And if we get sued, we're able to point to the state agency that's responsible for administering elections. in overseeing elections. As we've seen, that is not always a fail-safe with some courts in the state who don't defer to the Elections Commission. So that, short of administrative rules, which have the force of law, like a statute does, clerks would like to get as much guidance as possible. On the other hand, the Elections Commission staff will often tell clerks, this is our guidance, this is our opinion, but check with your municipal attorney in your specific situation.
Okay, well, that would be you, sir.
This episode is brought to you by ShipStation. If you run an e-commerce business, you know how much work it takes to produce something great while dealing with complicated shipping issues. That's why over 130,000 companies have turned to ShipStation, an innovative tool that allows you to focus less on shipping and more on building your brand. With ShipStation, you can manage orders, label printing, reporting, and customer service on one easy-to-use dashboard. You'll reduce warehouse costs with reliable enterprise solutions and save thousands on shipping costs with discounts up to 89% off. Plus, you can effortlessly import orders from everywhere you sell online. So, turn your shipping challenges into opportunities for growth. Go to ShipStation.com and use code POD to sign up for your free 60-day trial. That's ShipStation.com, code POD.
How do you think this gets resolved? So, our city clerk is following the state constitution.
Well, I think as most Madisonians know, we have an excellent city clerk, I think one of the best in the state, and staff of the clerk's office that works really hard every day to help serve voters and pull off elections. I think, again, we're going to have to give the Elections Commission a little bit of time to try to sort this out. Or on the other hand, if they're not able to, then at least we know that we're pretty much on our own. The one issue we haven't talked about is that the state statute currently says that all election officials have to be residents of the county where they are serving. So all of these people that I mentioned before that are helping with elections, there's no guarantee that they're going to be residents of the county, much less the city. Not all.
So if you rent a truck from Columbia County, is that violating the amendment?
Even if we're renting a truck from a business in Madison, there's no guarantee that the truck driver is going to be a resident of the county. Even city employees, they're not required to be residents of the city or the county. If you're a clerk, I guess I would pose to your listeners, how would you handle this situation when we have laws in the books that contradict the state constitutional amendment, which is very vague, there's no guidance, and yet you're responsible for pulling off an election in a way that you're not going to be sued and that people will have confidence in, regardless of the results. And we have seen, obviously, in 2020 that there are people that will try to cast doubt about the process in order to question the results if they're on the losing side.
So that's like why the worst case scenario is a lawsuit, because even if the city is successful, there's this question of integrity of the election that is just automatically challenged.
Right. I would say, the one thing that's a little bit different in 2020 is we have the experience now of some people being held to account for essentially lying about the election in 2020. I don't know if that will have any effect to tamp down the desire to just say anything we want about the elections and in order to create doubt. But hopefully people are paying attention to the defamation lawsuits and people being disbarred from practicing law because of what they said about the 2020 election. I will also say that the legislature is not being helpful here. The legislature is not in session for the rest of the year. They've left this mess for the clerks and the Elections Commission to sort out. And the legislature is not going to be anywhere helpful if there are lawsuits.
Maybe we should just take a step back. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong here. So the impetus for this only election officials can work on elections amendment that passed, the voters passed it, It seems to stem from one private consultant working for the city of Green Bay on election logistics. This individual was accused of having partisan ties, but it also started all these unfounded rumors about election interference. So we're amending the state constitution because of this one dude? Am I missing something?
I don't think so. I think that just points out that the real goal here is to show that something is being done supposedly to fix elections where one party or candidate lost when there's no fix required. In that specific case, as you mentioned, Green Bay had hired a consultant working for a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization who was there on site on election day and before election day to help with best practices around elections. And some people were concerned that this consultant was on site either at the polling place or in the clerk's office on election day. Eventually, that was brought to the attention of the Elections Commission, and the Elections Commission, out of an abundance of caution, told him to not be at the polling place on election day. So that was taken care of. The process, the system worked. And yet, Donald Trump lost the city of Green Bay, and there had to be a reason why. And people latched onto this as the reason why votes were cast the way that they were cast. Now, I've heard Senator Wimberger, the lead sponsor of this amendment, say, this is no problem. Clerks can simply, quote, hereby designate anybody to be an election official. First of all, there's no authority for that in the constitutional amendment or in the statutes. Secondly, do these people have to take an oath of office as election officials do? And thirdly, if that's the solution, then this consultant in Green Bay could have been hereby designated as an election official, and there's no need for a constitutional amendment that is creating all this confusion.
Well, there was another constitutional amendment that we'll touch on real quick here that also passed in April. This one is a prohibition on using grants or private money to cover election costs. So is the city of Madison concerned about the vagueness of this amendment?
Well, I think not immediately, because the city did receive a grant for the 2024 elections. It's all been spent on some much needed equipment. And so we don't have any pending grants being offered, but it does potentially create some confusion because, again, of the vague wording. Is a grant, does it include money that people might donate to buy food for poll workers who are completing 15-hour shifts? Does it include equipment that is donated to a municipality to be used at a polling place? Are we required to now pay for equipment that is essentially an in-kind donation for polling places that are a VFW hall or a church or other locations? Now, these may seem like minor questions, but again, I think this amendment was sort of a solution in search of a problem. I don't have the sense that these large grants are going to be offered continually in the future, but if they were not offered in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic, the city would not have had a budget to conduct the elections, the fall elections. Our elections budget was all spent after the April presidential primary in 2020 because of the pandemic and this great increase in absentee voting and the need for personal protective equipment and to pay people to work who weren't enthusiastic about being in a communal environment with other people in close proximity.
So during the pandemic in particular, this private money, and it was from this grant money, it was needed by cities like Madison.
Well, and I will say this piece of equipment that the city has purchased with the recent grant is meant to help us process absentee ballots, both going out the door and coming back in a high-speed fashion. That was also in part a result of the pandemic, because the pandemic created a great increase in the number of people who wanted to vote by absentee ballot. And that will be continuing on into the future.
Why do you think these amendments passed?
Well, if you read them, they seem fairly simplistic. There's a fair policy debate there to be had. I think, frankly, that the state should help to fund elections more specifically and step up to the plate and realize what these clerks are facing. And we shouldn't have a private money.
Yeah, that's one way to get rid of all the Zucker bucks, right? Okay.
Right. And also, only election officials should be conducting elections. That seems reasonable enough. But this was not obviously like a typical campaign where you have candidates out there debating the merits of the question. There were some efforts to get sort of the real story out there and the risk in passing these. I was frankly surprised at how close the results were, because I thought, well, it's hard for voters to really grasp the complexities of conducting elections and really what's at stake here. And they will just reflexively vote yes. But
the other side of it maybe is like we still have a presidential candidate that insists that the election was stolen in Wisconsin in 2020. It wasn't. Do you think these amendments will help reassure voters, even Trump voters, that our elections are fair?
I would say logically, if we could, I say logically because we're kind of
a very logical era we are in.
Right. If we had some guidance from the Elections Commission that both parties and the Election Commission bought into as representatives of their party, hopefully that would help. But I guess that is a wait and see.
City Attorney Michael Haas, thank you so much for explaining these new constitutional amendments that local clerks across the state are still trying to figure out. So thank you.
Thank you. I would just encourage all your listeners, if they're not registered to vote, now is a great time to do that. Go on My Vote Wisconsin and make sure you're registered for the fall.
That's Michael Haas, Madison City Attorney. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who communicates clearly? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Ciao.